Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, a good morning to all of you. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to IPI and to this year's Trygve Symposium on Fundamental Freedoms, organized in partnership with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Named after the first Secretary General of the UN, Trygve, the symposium explores ways in which the international community can strengthen its promotion and protection of human rights. Today's discussion will focus on the theme of media freedom as a fundamental freedom and a human right, protecting journalists and their access to conflict areas. Having a free and open press and protecting journalists is essential for not just democracy, but for human rights to flourish. This year, the annual World Press Freedom Index, identified a global decline in press freedom, highlighting that, and I quote, press freedom around the world is being threatened by the very people who should be its guarantors, political authorities. This decline is most viscerally manifested in growing threats to journalists. Nobel Peace Prize laureate and world-renowned journalist from the Philippines, Maria Ressa, who we will be featuring at IPI this afternoon, has said, and I quote, "If you want to rip the heart out of a democracy, you go after the facts," end quote. And at a time of ongoing wars and rising geopolitical tensions and polarization, defending and protecting media freedom is more important than ever. I am honored to welcome to IPI our distinguished panelists, His Excellency Espen Barth Eide, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway, and may I say also one of the most cerebral foreign ministers you're going to ever meet. So we expect something very cerebral from you now. So, we also have Her Excellency Irene Khan, the former Secretary General of Amnesty International and now UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of freedom of opinion and expression, who is with us virtually. Welcome, Irene, and delighted to have you with us. We have also with us Jody Ginsburg, CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jody, again, welcome. And we have Andrea Cairola, advisor for the section for the freedom of expression and safety of journalists at UNESCO. We are also joined by Rafa Renas, a producer based in Sudan, who is joining us virtually, and also Hazem Balusha, a journalist who spent the last 2 decades reporting from the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, who's also joining us virtually today. Welcome, Rafa and Hazem. The biographies of these distinguished panelists are in your program, so please refer to them. It's now a great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Espen for his initial remarks. And perhaps, Espen, you can help us understand the challenge facing press freedom around the world and what can be done to protect journalists who are under threat. So over to you, please.
Well, thank you so much, Zeid, and thanks for bringing us together. It's great to be again at the Trygve Symposium. It's a long and very good tradition during the UNGA week, and good to work with you again, as we have over many decades. And I should say thank you for that alarming introduction, which makes me very worried about what I'm going to deliver. But what I want to say is that this is really extremely important topics, and make no mistakes, it's not only a topic that should interest journalists or people who have a particular interest in media. This is, as was quoted, this is essential for democracy. If we want to maintain democratic, open, deliberative societies that are able to make informed decisions. Because, you know, when we ask people to actually vote and contribute to decision making, you know, the counterbalance is that there should be a public discourse which can inform that decision making in a different way than just, you know, building gangs of loyalty to a leader. Which is the alternative version. And journalism is critical to maintain that type of society. And journalism is in serious trouble. Media freedom is in trouble. But it's both on the side of media freedom, you know, what governments do to allow media to be independent, impartial, work safely and securely and get access. But of course, happens in parallel to the rise of the algorithms and rise of media channels that are not editorial, where nobody is really responsible apart from some kind of algorithm that helps you reconfirm the positions you already have or radicalize the positions you already have. So the second is not really the topic of today, but I just want to say at the outset that these things are actually related because both things happen at the same time. Even if we had absolute media freedom for written journalism or classic ether media, TV and radio, we still would have a problem because a lot of people, and unfortunately many young people, are principally getting their, as their primary source of information, not to the New York Times, to put it that way, but you know, the Instagram channel or the Snapchat or TikTok or whatever it is, which is not being produced in a way that invites counterbalance and response and all these principles of good journalism. But to the core issue. The truth is the first victim of war, it is frequently said, and in one of the situations in which journalism is in particularly heavy trouble now is in conflict and also in authoritarian situations. We see censorship, we see the milder version, which is lack of will to provide access, or the harder version, which is active steps to hinder or block access, and also political cultures developing where people having alternative opinions are interpreted as problematic or the enemy, and where impartiality and a free space for conversation is seen as dangerous. And this is happening all around the world. And I think we will come back to this in the conversation, but right now I think it is fair to mention the conflict in the Middle East, where we have seen the highest number proportionally of journalism actually killed in conflict, which in the proportion of that over the last year has been shockingly high on the planet, and very many of the cases come from Gaza or from Palestine, and this is really alarming, and it's particularly alarming because it happens in a context where criticizing one side or the other has become extremely polarized. And for instance, in this country, it is very difficult to say anything before, you know, put into some kind of one side or the other. And that makes discussing it even more difficult on this side of the Atlantic than it is on my side of the Atlantic. But this is problematic. And I think, but the problem is universal because, you know, in order to be able to understand what actually happens, you need information, you need journalists to be able to work, and ideally you'd like to have different types of journalists to come in with different approaches. And when that is severely limited, you will, you know, just get one type of information, and that's problematic in itself. And then we have all these places. After all, Ukraine and the Middle East is on the agenda, so there is an interest, and many people would like to find out what's going on there. But we have a plethora of conflict areas where people hardly ask what's happening. Sudan being the #1 case, but also Yemen, Myanmar, and the Sahel, and Mali, and West Africa, and so many places where you have the same type of challenges, both same type of human rights violations, wars, but also restrictions of media freedom, which don't even. It isn't even registered. But I think it's really important also to go to in these most conflictual and most focused areas and try to look into how we can improve the situation there, because it will have a ripple effect. If you know, attacking journalists with impunity becomes the norm, it will quickly spread to be the norm everywhere. And this is a really dangerous situation that should worry us all, also people who are way out of the media business as such. And that would require reestablishing the principle that it's a good thing that you have a critical journalist, that we as government, although it can be annoying on any given day that we have all these critical questions against us, we still understand that the type of society we want to represent is better off with free speech and free media. It is to make sure that attacks, but also sort of active hindrance of free media activity should not go without impunity. It has to be spoken about, and that there should be a particular level of protection given to journalists, because like aid workers, like medical staff, these are people who actually do a service to more people than themselves and should also be understood as such. So I think to really just to have this meeting and talk about this has a value in itself, but we need to bring this to a broader audience. And I would like to say, and I think I may be stealing your point from another discussion, but I think we agree very much on this. Media freedom is not just one issue that lives its own life. As you said earlier, Zeid, it's a part of an ecosystem. If human rights break down, if rule of law breaks down, you should not be surprised. You should not be surprised if also media freedom breaks down, and it's hard to reestablish it on its own. Because it is part of a broader ecosystem of civil society that is there to correct and criticize, but also help the establishment of good governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Espen, for kicking us off with that spirited start, a very thought-provoking start. Irene, same question to you from your vantage and your perspective, and you've had a long history grappling with this issue. So perhaps you could also present us with your assessment. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Zeid, and thank you for giving me this opportunity and for selecting this subject at such an important time, I think, given the international situation. Now, as you said, media freedom is in dangerous decline in almost every region of the world. Totalitarian states have always been intolerant, but today, news media is actually coming under heavy pressure in backsliding democracies, where authoritarian trends are on the rise, judicial and legal systems are being weaponized against those who criticize the regime, and populist leaders are actually demonizing, discrediting, and endangering journalists with their rhetoric. I make that point because it adds to what Ide was saying about looking at the ecosystem, looking at the context in which today media freedom is becoming even more threatened in conflict situations. Journalism today is one of the most dangerous professions in the world. Threat exists, of course, in multiple ways in many places, but it is particularly high in times of conflict. So the question is, how do we make journalism safer? Now, journalists are protected as civilians under international humanitarian law, but I do support Ide's point that unlike many other civilians, they cannot move away from the fighting. In fact, they have to move towards it to be able to report. So they are at heightened risk. And it needs to be recognized. The UN Security Council resolutions have recognized the risks. The General Assembly, the Security Council, the Human Rights Council have all called on states and parties to protect journalists in conflict. But unfortunately, the casualty figures show that these pleas are falling on deaf ears. Now, Israel's assault on Gaza stands out starkly as the deadliest conflict for journalists in 30 years since UNESCO started keeping a record on killings. But from the testimonies that I have received, journalists that I have met, and documentation that I have seen, I am deeply concerned that the pattern of killings and arbitrary detention of journalists, large-scale destruction of press facilities and equipment in Gaza, and now the crackdown in the West Bank seems to show a deliberate strategy by Israeli military to silence critical reporting and obstruct the documentation of possible international crimes. The evidence is there. Journalists have provided it themselves through their investigative work. Human rights NGOs have produced it. evidence has been given to the ICC, but yet the UN appears paralyzed. That's the real problem that we have on our hands. The other point I want to make is that in conflict situations, very often, it's the local journalists who are really on the front line. In the case of Gaza, of course, Israel has blocked or refused access, unhindered access to foreign media. But in many situations, even where there is access, it's the local journalists who tend to get hurt, tend to face the worst situations. And without their commitment, the world wouldn't know the truth, wouldn't know about the humanitarian crisis, the war crimes. But because they are local, I don't think the international community pays as much attention to this issue as they would if these were well-known journalists from the New York Times or the Guardian. Now, killing a journalist is the most egregious form of censorship, but it thrives because of impunity. In 9 out of 10 cases, there is no investigation, prosecution, or punishment for killing a journalist. And of course, impunity then emboldens perpetrators. If you take the case of the occupied Palestinian territories, of the 58 or more targeted killings of journalists that have happened there since UN records were kept, none, not a single one, has ever led to an independent, open investigation, prosecution, or punishment. Blanket impunity is a license to kill. And killing a journalist takes away one life, but it chills many voices. So it's a very, very dangerous weapon. And we shouldn't ignore other threats to safety of journalists, which sometimes are combined even in conflict situations together with the physical threats. Targeted electronic surveillance, for example, online threats, especially towards women, against women journalists. And of course, they exist in peace times, but they are heightened during conflict. And another thing to keep in mind is that the chilling of media freedom is not confined only to the area of conflict, but in countries implicated in the conflict. Look at the state of media today in Israel or in Russia, even worse. And I would like to point out to the legal system that is often used to prosecute and punish journalists. In many conflict situations or situations of insecurity, journalists are being charged, prosecuted, and jailed under national security laws, counterterrorism laws, fake news laws, criminal libel laws. So on the one hand, the law is not available to protect them, but on the other hand, the law is used constantly against them. 14 years ago, the UN adopted a plan of action on safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. The plan inspired many governments, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental initiatives, but looking at the impact, obviously, it is not enough. And therefore, much more needs to be done. And I would like to start first with the issue of impunity. Numerous cases have been submitted to the International Criminal Court, and the prosecutor must act on it. But outside this ICC, there must be renewed effort to strengthen independent mechanisms for investigation with a special focus on killing of journalists. I think there are a number of mechanisms in the UN human rights system, commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions, and others. I think they need to get more active. The issue, of course, is getting access on the ground. And there, it's a question of political will. It's not a question of lack of legal provisions for protection. Secondly, I agree with Mr. Aide that we should be looking at international humanitarian law and ensure that journalists receive some heightened protection. They're at a heightened risk. And the job that they're doing on the ground is as important, we have found out, as health or provision of other services. I have said in my report on armed conflict and freedom of expression that information is a survival right. People need it in order to survive. Civilians need it. The world needs to know. And so journalists should get heightened protection. I also believe that at the national level, a lot of the laws should be removed. Journalism should not be a criminal act. And of course, at the end of the day, we are talking about physical, digital, and legal threats to journalists these days, and they require complex, strong, multi-stakeholder endeavors. So states, international organizations, digital companies, media companies, and civil society have to come together. And one would like to think that the place where they would come together is the United Nations, but it can be outside the United Nations. But we need to look at this entire sort of multifaceted problem that is very, very dangerous. And as you know, it's common to say that media freedom is a pillar of democracy. But imagine if media freedom is in decline, then what is the state of that pillar holding up democracy?
No, thank you very much, Irene. And your last point, I think, is where we really need to dig deep, no? I mean, we can say we need better coordination. We can say we need better sort of marshalling of the energies to shed light and to sort of push for a change. But how we do that will be answered by my next guest, Jody Ginsberg, CEO of Committee to Protect Journalists. I mean, the very title of your organization will enlighten us, I think.
I'll do my best. What I want to do this morning is try to put some context around the numbers that we hear and the overall picture that our two previous speakers have given. Certainly where we sit at the Committee to Protect Journalists, and we've been doing this work for 4 decades, this is without doubt the most dangerous environment for journalists that we have ever seen. Not only is it, we're looking at one of the deadliest years for journalists on record. We have near record numbers of journalists in jail, imprisoned on a variety of charges, as we heard from Irene, from terrorism to sedition, but equally being charged on charges apparently not related to journalism at all, on tax evasion, on money laundering. So there are many more ways than ever before that journalists are being targeted, either through jailings, through physical attacks that can sometimes be fatal, but also increasingly through harassment and other mechanisms that are intended to silence journalists. And to give you some sense of what that looks like, I've been a journalist for more than 2 decades. When I first started as a journalist, the only people that got hostile environment training were people who were going to go and cover a war. And you would go for your 5 days of training, and people would simulate kidnappings and teach you how to estimate crowds and how to identify safe places. Nowadays, news organizations are providing hostile environment training for people who are going to cover protests in democratic countries, because those might turn violent. We are seeing journalists covering politics, for example, in the White House or Westminster, who receive death threats, threats of rape, threats to their families on a daily basis for covering politics in some of the world's largest democracies. That gives you a sense of the kind of environment in which journalists across the world are operating. And if those are the kinds of risks being faced by journalists in countries notionally at peace, imagine the threats, therefore, they face in conflict zones. And that's particularly important at the moment because we now see more countries engaged in conflict than at any time since World War II. So that means the risks to journalists are multiplied exponentially. And the context has changed in another way, which is in previous years, certainly in the very beginnings of journalists going to war zones, in the late 19th century and so on, there was some understanding that perhaps journalists were necessary for governments and other warring parties to get their message out. That is no longer the case. Governments and others can speak directly to the population using their own social media. They have no need for journalists to be present and to be witnessing. And that makes journalists all that more vulnerable, because if they are there without any kind of protection from any party, they're extremely vulnerable. And not only are they not necessarily tolerated, they may actually indeed be targeted. And that's certainly something we are increasingly concerned is happening in Gaza. We've already heard from Irene about the high numbers of casualties. So far, Committee Protect Journalists has documented 116 killings since October the 7th. All but 5 of those are Palestinian journalists. And in at least 5 cases, we know that those journalists have been deliberately targeted, and we're investigating several more. That would, of course, constitute a war crime. But of course, it's not just the targeting of those journalists, it's also the arrests that we've seen in Gaza and the West Bank, and other attacks, such as the closure of media offices. You may have seen the images last week of armed military Israeli forces going into the Al Jazeera offices in the West Bank. I want you to imagine that for a moment. Imagine we're all sitting here doing our daily jobs, the things that we do, and armed forces come in with guns while Al Jazeera was on air to stop them broadcasting, doing their legitimate job, which is to bring us information that is so crucial in a time of war when, as we've already heard, truth is the first casualty. So what can be done to answer the question?
Yes, that's what we're waiting.
We have to, I wish I had the magic answer. I think the first thing to say is we have existing instruments for protecting journalists, and we are not seeing them implemented. So Security Council Resolution 2222, passed in 2015, already requires states to protect journalists, not only as members of the civilian population, but because of their particular social function. And it requires measures to be taken to protect journalists, media professionals, and associated personnel in the field. And we are simply not seeing that implemented. So the first thing that we could do is to ensure that the UN and member states are putting pressure on their colleagues to make sure those instruments are fully implemented. Independent commissions of inquiry and UN investigations should include journalists as a distinct category among civilians. Impunity, as we've heard, is a major issue for the safety of journalists, and we have to put a stop to this. We've now been trying for over a decade to move the needle on impunity for journalists, and it simply failed. So we need new tools, including, I think, investigative bodies that can specifically look at journalist killings and hold people to account, and to provide funding so that those investigations can take place locally. Because one of the challenges that we often have is we're entirely reliant on essentially families to push through justice for killed journalists with very little resources and without the backing of the international community. So better resourcing for those kinds of investigations would help improve things. And I think one of the things we absolutely have to see is governments not just simply talking in general terms about the importance of press freedom. We hear a lot of warm words about press freedom. Frankly, we see much less action from press freedom supporting governments to take specific actions and certainly call out countries individually when they seem to be breaching journalists' rights. And I think we can see a significant step up from those governments who purports to believe in press freedom to actually put their money where their mouths are.
I'm going to come back to you, Jody, because having worked with the International Criminal Court very closely, it's not just you send photography, you'd send film, you send testimonies that guarantees an investigation comes. You have to know the rules of procedure and evidence. There's a chain of custody of the evidence that you need to be aware of. You need to know that what you're putting forward links the conduct to a perpetrator, often the author of the crime, in other words, the one who's taking the decision to launch an attack that isn't keeping with jus in bello, that it's clearly disproportionate, it clearly violates IHL in the context of firing at a protected person, i.e. a journalist. But that goes to your point, which I think is critical, which is with enough resourcing, that can be done. I mean, it's a very credible thing. So let's turn to you, Andrea. And so please enlighten us as to the perspective that's taken in UNESCO together with, of course, my old office, OHCHR. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zeid and IPI, for convening this symposium. His Excellency, Ambassador, Distinguished Delegate, Representative of Civil Society, Special Rapporteur, all protocol observed. I think, of course, the magnitude of the problem has been described, and I'll try, as you asked, to dig deep in what could be the pushback to that. And to do it, I think it's important to look to what has been done, what has worked, what does not work, to inform, of course, evidence-based what to tackle this issue. So 32 years ago, the UNGA proclaimed the World Press Freedom Day in honor of a landmark Windhoek Declaration in Namibia about free pluralist press in Africa. So since then, every year, a community that has been growing, including many people that are in this room from civil society and representing the media, has been convening on the World Press Freedom Day around the world in a global conference, but also in events around the world. And this community and this convening around the world shows that this is really a universal issue. So first point, this is, of course, a universal issue, and there is need to further strengthen, continue this advocacy, an advocacy that is also reinforced by the proclamation of the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists on 2nd of November, since a decade, which next commemoration will be at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. So advocacy first, but then, as the Special Rapporteur mentioned, there is since 12 years a UN plan of action on safety of journalists and the issue of impunity around 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. It's not a plan of the UN, it's a multi-stakeholder plan that has been developed together with this community and, of course, is implemented with this community. So 2 years ago, on the 10 years of the plan, there's been a stock-taking exercise to assess where this community has been going over this decade. And there are results, undoubtedly. For instance, there are more and more resolutions. You're all involved within the 3 UN headquarters in New York, Geneva, and Paris, but also in regional organizations. There is an SDG 1610.1 specific indicator. Recently now, the issue of safety journalists is also in the Pact for the Future. So there is, of course, an international framework that is reaffirmed. But then what to do at local level? So in this stock-taking exercise, it showed that, for instance, creating national mechanism on safety of journalists is part of the response. Training judges, as UNESCO, we've been training over 35,000 judges around the world, is part of the response also to tackle impunity. In this regard, in 10 years, there has been a decline of impunity from 95 to 86, according to a monitoring we are doing as UNESCO based on inquiry to member states. It's just 9 percentage point, is too high, is unacceptable. As you said, we are failing in that, but at least it's an indicator or what can be done. There is also the importance of reinforcing the local civil society, including, for instance, the lawyers network specialized around the defense. The work with the newsroom in an environment that is disrupted by a perfect storm for the media in terms of viability, in terms, of course, of challenges, as you said, that now the media apparently are less needed, while actually are even more needed. And I think the story of the importance more and more of collaborative investigative journalists is showing that a certain type of quality professional media is even more needed and can really change a trajectory of history in a country just with one story. But this, as said, is not enough. In this stock-taking exercise that culminated in a conference hosted by the government of Austria in Vienna, there was a call to action by the civil society, because in the implementation of the UN Plan of Action, there are different coordination mechanisms, because it's for a coalition-based approach. There is a media freedom coalition that was already mentioned. There is also a CSO coalition on safety of journalists. And it was based on consultation at regional level, but also at thematic level around, for instance, the issue of safety of women journalists, the issue of digital safety. There is a call to action to do more, and of course to invest more and to tackle the challenge in a way that requires, on one hand, this, of course, multi-stakeholder approach, holistic approach, etc. But then ultimately what is making the difference, and I know that after me they will be hearing voices from colleagues working in difficult environment, what is making the difference is ultimately for the individual journalist that is, of course, subject to the threat, is subject to the imprisonment, and has to be helped in in tackling these challenges. Thank
No,
you.
and I think that point that, I mean, it's amazing to think that that there's so many journalists that are willing to forfeit so much for their profession. You know, to overcome that first instinct that we all have of self-preservation. You know, most people are cowards. I mean, basically, put it laid out there. So many journalists are not. I mean, they're willing to take the ultimate risk to do the right thing. I was always amazed that people knowingly publish when only a few hours later they understand they would be detained. They understand that some harm could come to them. They may never see their families again, and they still do it. I mean, it's so inspiring. It's amazing, really. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn over, and thank you, Andrea, for saying this, because we have two colleagues now who are reporting from both Sudan and from Gaza, have been, and they will enlighten us further as to the risks they take, and perhaps also help us understand, in addition to all the comments made, what it is that we can do. So can I turn to you, Rafa, and you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rafa Rinas, a Sudanese filmmaker and journalist, joining you virtually from Nairobi. While I speak to you today, my heart remains in Sudan, where a devastating war is destroying life and silence voices. Today, I want to share my personal story. Last year, 2023, while covering the situation in refugee camps, I was followed and harassed by intelligence forces. Their goal was obvious, to intimidate me and silence the truth. This attack wasn't just on me. It targeted anyone trying to shed light on the suffering on those camps. My story is just one of many. Since the war began on April 15, 2023, the dangers facing journalists across Sudan have been worse, according to Sudanese Journalists Syndicate. They documented 4,038 violations against journalists. Some have been physically assaulted, including cases of sexual violence, and 39 cases of kidnapping, detention, and arrest. The violence against journalists have been escalated beyond threats and violence. According to the Sudanese Journalists Syndicate and other press organizations, 11 journalists have been killed during the war in Sudan, since last year, of course. This killing underscored the grave danger Sudanese journalists face as they continue to report on the conflict. This is the harsh reality of Sudanese journalists: intimidation, threats, violence, and even death, all aim to silence us. My message today is urgent. Sudanese journalists need better protection. They require physical and digital security, improved training for reporting in war zones, and essential resources, funding, equipment, and legal support. Without this, the truth about Sudan may be lost in the chaos of war. But protecting journalists is only part of the solution. We must keep the conversation about Sudan alive. This conflict is not just regional. It is a human rights crisis that demands global attention. The world must listen and take action. We can shine a light on the crisis and help those who is affected. But I urge each of you today to become advocate for Sudanese journalists and to support the organization fighting to protect media freedom. And I think together we must ensure that those stories which must be told are never silenced.
Thank you for that, and I'm sure we'll return to you in a few moments. We will now turn to Hazem. Hazem, if you're with us, I hope you've heard the interventions thus far. You have 20 years of experience covering all sorts of issues relating to Palestine, from security, politics, culture, both in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for having me today. Actually, I wasn't brave enough to stay in Gaza. I was in Gaza when it started, the war started, and and I escaped and fled with my family because this is the most essential thing. I spent about a month in Gaza during the war, and I had to leave because, as you mentioned, all of you, how dangerous and unbelievable situation in Gaza. I'm not gonna talk about facts, as you all know what's happening there. I mean, the huge number of journalists that being killed in Gaza, the deliberate restriction on foreign media accessing to Gaza. I mean, unfortunately, Israel never allowed for foreign journalists to access to Gaza, not only this time, all the conflicts time, except one time, which some people said that it was a mistake. It was in 2014 war. So apart from that, I mean, never foreign media was able to access to Gaza. And in the same time, the international community is asking for truth, while nobody is allowed to be in there, which is an essential issue. I cover the conflict there, I cover it in the West Bank, and I know how the situation, we are talking about different layers of restrictions. It's not only from the Israeli side, of course, this is the most important, but over the years, we are talking about like restrictions from different parties, whether the local authorities or the neighboring countries, or in the top is the Israeli restriction and attacking deliberately many times journalists and media workers. Of course, it's not the issue here, but we are talking about the problem that, you know, if we go a little bit back when at the situation in Gaza, Gaza that has no I would summarize it like there's no industry in journalism in Gaza. So that means somehow that there is an importance of investing in this, because if we are looking for a freedom of media, we need a free press and access to them. Now, who remained in Gaza now? I mean, most of the journalists who are working with mainstream media, well-known outlets, they have fled Gaza, except those who got trapped there because the border was closed out of sudden. Many journalists, all the journalists were asked to evacuate from the north to the south. And gradually, and at the time in the beginning, like I decided to leave Gaza actually from the second week. I consider myself, I was late, but the crossing was closed and I couldn't leave till the next month or the late of the first month, to be honest. So if the doors were open, I believe that most of the journalists who are able to leave, they would leave. They wouldn't hesitate to leave, because situation there, because they have families, they have life. I mean, it's not like I'm not isolated from the community. I don't have a protection because I'm a journalist. I have to take care about my family, my kids, my wife, and the beloved people that I know. So I'm drained from the situation. I mean, if I want to describe the day that when I was in Gaza, I was like, I got displaced like within a month, like 5 times. One of them I slept in the front yard of the Shifa hospital in Gaza City, because that was like I fled from my home when it was targeted from, I mean, not the house but nearby, from the day 1 on October 7, and we got a disconnection. I lost the telecommunication and the internet access from that. So I moved to a local hotel, and at the same night at 2 a.m. a nearby building was threatened to be destroyed or targeted, and so we had to evacuate and to run like to a different place. So I had no place to go at 2 a.m. So I went to the Shifa hospital and I spent the night there with my 2 little kids. So what I'm talking about, or trying to, like, I talked to some colleagues who are still in Gaza, and I asked them that if do you have like messages that you want to deliver to the audience that I'm talking to today. So it's like all of them, they are frustrated. they know that nothing would come out and to protect their life there. When I was there, like my outlet that I'm working with, I mean, they passed my location to the IDF and they said, okay, it's noted, but we can't guarantee his safety. So I might be not a target, okay, but I could be in a wrong place and someone else would be harmed, and in the same time that would affect me and my life. So there are a lot of stories to talk about, and in the same time we are trying even from abroad that to reach people, to talk to people, to access to people. In the same time that there is lack of internet in Gaza, there's the blackouts many times occurred in Gaza Strip, so which restricted our access to the people many times. We are trying our best from abroad to reach people and to tell the story of the people, the truth about the situation in Gaza. I know it's not the same as if we were there, if we experience the same way that the people are living, but the way we are doing it, I think that we are at least trying to deliver the message and to tell the people about the situation, as that's why all of you know and hear about what's happening in Gaza or in the West Bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazem, for that. I mean, a very honest account of your own experience, a very human account. I mean, no one is in a position to judge any journalist unless you experience the conditions themselves. And so I thank all the panelists for the initial round. I wonder, in the interaction with the audience, if we could also give some attention to Espen's initial point, which is, you know, we speak about the media, and we speak about independent media, and we speak about how necessary it is, and we speak about needing a diversity of opinion, but we can't also let it pass. And the point that you made about not just sort of unedited media streams that come through different channels, but so much of the dislocation, so much of the disruption of facts come from media organizations that have basically carried hatred back into the systems of the world, right? I mean, we know that, you know, Silvio Berlusconi in 1994 opened the door for the Northern League to enter the government. He controlled 3 media organizations in Italy. It sort of opened the path. When you look at what happened in Austria a few years later, the FPO joined the government in Austria. Right? It's only a few decades after the end of the Second World War. In other words, media and the fundamental nature of it, the need to serve a public purpose, the need to convey facts, has also been disrupted by these other features. And of course, there's the Rupert Murdoch empire stretching across the world, and that also, the effect is well known. And so how will we separate all of this and ensure that when we speak about this, we are discriminating between those outlets that do their very best to convey the truth as they see it, the facts as they see it, in a way that's responsible, as you were saying, that there's an editorial side to it, from those that try and disrupt the market for profit-making and for political gain, often at the expense of others, very deliberate. But perhaps I can go to you, Espen, and then I don't know if Jody would like to touch on this, but when you ask your questions, perhaps we can have a discussion around that as well.
Thank you, Zeid. I just want to remind everyone, we've seen this movie before. In the early 1930s, at the late days of the Weimar Republic in Germany, there was a rich media scene, several different newspapers. There was a rich art scene and very good universities. A weak, but still a democracy. And Adolf Hitler and his stormtroops and Hitlerjugend, they started to attack all of this. And Hitler enjoyed the word Lügenpresse, which means the lying press, today known as mainstream media. There were physical attacks at lectures at universities and disrupting long before the killing. You know, disrupting theaters and other kinds of expressions, and the very active use of what was then the new media, which was radio, speaking directly to people to not have to go through, you know, journalistic circles, and mass rallies. And if anybody feels that sounds familiar, it can happen again. And so the link bit, which just, and burning of books, by the way, you know, a very popular thing was to burn books because we didn't like those facts. We would like to have alternative facts, which there was then created as an alternative set packages of fact that you were supposed to believe in, not to arrive at through science, but just believe in. So the link between democracy and a free press, you know, is very, very important, and that movie did not end very well, as we might recall. And then I want to say, I think the very good points were made by both Rafa and Hussein. Rafa, the situation in Sudan, and in Sudan, on top of the extreme challenges of being a journalist, and let me highlight that, as she said, there's a particularly challenging these days to be female journalists. You know, what happens to all journalists is extremely severe in the case of many female journalists also, which comes with a bigger package of increasing attacks on women and attacks of the idea of gender equality, which is part of the global cultural war in a sense. So that also affects women journalists, but it affects them more than male journalists. And to Hassem, the fact that Israel does not allow international media is, of course, also in order to be able to say that the real journalists who are doing an extremely brave job, either for local outlet or for Al Jazeera, are in a sense linked to the warring faction, to take away their identity as independent media, which is very systematic, which will be more difficult with New York Times or BBC. So that's exactly why they're not supposed to be there, because it's easier to do the job in that sense. So I think those 2 points are very important. And yeah, that's basically what I want to say.
Thank you, Espen. Jodie?
So to answer the question that you asked about media ownership and the concerns around certain media pushing certain narratives, I think we need to be really careful, because what we have seen in response to some of that is the introduction of laws that ultimately limit a free, pluralistic, independent media. We've seen the introduction of fake news, false news laws across the world, and increasingly they're being used not to deal with the kind of mis and disinformation that I think you're talking about, but to target individuals and news outlets who are critical of government. So I think we need to be very careful when we talk about good media and bad media, because invariably the kinds of laws that people try to introduce to deal with what they see to be mis and disinformation, which is absolutely at the heart of some of these challenges, actually ends up strangling the very free and independent press that we want to encourage. And I would say, you know, for example, the tendency that we have, I think, to lump all kinds of media together is itself a dangerous one. I'm thinking of the example, for example, you talked about Murdoch Press. It's worth remembering that Evan Gershkovich, the journalist who was falsely and wrongfully detained by Russia, was working for the Wall Street Journal, doing exactly the kinds of essential independent reporting that we want to encourage. So I think we just need to be a little careful when we group all mainstream media together in that way. The second thing I wanted to say, and this is in response to something Rafa said, I think it's really important to understand the trauma being visited on journalists who are having to report on conflict. Conflicts are proliferating, they're much more prolonged, they're much more complex, they're much more enduring. And we at the Committee Protect Journalists are increasingly seeing requests more and more for psychological trauma and mental health support. In fact, we've been able to carry out a number of initiatives, including to support journalists in Sudan, who we were able to support with some group trauma support, also Russian journalists in exile and Burmese journalists in exile also. And that's, I think, going to be increasingly important. We haven't talked about the exile media issue, and hopefully we'll come back to that. But certainly this need for trauma support for journalists, for digital and security training and advice, I think is going to be essential. There's also questions around being able to provide things like personal protective equipment, which often is considered military hardware and therefore not accessible for journalists. So those areas where I think we can make concrete steps to improve the security and safety of journalists.
Yeah. No. Oh, thank you so much for that point and for also shedding light on that there is a problem with the way that I was framing it, and that's excellent. Thank you, Jody. Let's go to Irene. Sorry, I didn't see your hand initially, so Irene, to you.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to support Jody on this issue about introducing restrictions on media. You know, it's a very tricky thing. I'm coming from Bangladesh, and recently I was there during the uprising. I saw the way in, and of course previously, the total media capture by the regime. And now journalists are being attacked by mobs. They're being arrested. They're being accused of murder, of incitement to violence, and so on, because about 90% or 95% of the media had actually fallen into line with the previous regime. It's a very important issue, however, to remember that most of the time when we see movements like this starting, it's not necessarily media that starts it. Media joins it, media encourages it, but there's a political stream there. And this media, and one of the big threats to media, the first is physical, the second is legal, and the third, I would say, is media capture. That is something we need to look at, but there are things that we can do, even particularly in democratic societies. For example, transparency about media ownership. There is no requirement, or there wasn't any requirement until very recently in the European Union to even show who owns media. So that is one thing. The second, of course, is to create an enabling environment for professionalization of journalists. And particularly in developing countries, that's extremely important. And instruments of self-regulation. Media needs a kind of a hybrid environment. There may be some state regulation, but there should be a lot of self-regulation of media. And there are some initiatives. I think RSF has a system of kind of evaluating independence of the media. So there are lots of interesting initiatives there that civil society is doing, and that's worth looking into before going into legislation. My second point was about journalists in exile. You know, at the last Human Rights Council, I submitted a report on precisely that subject, and I discovered that it doesn't get the degree of attention it should. Many journalists are fleeing and do not have any means of fleeing. They're treated like refugees, but they're not refugees because they want to continue promoting, their profession, to make political statements when they are abroad, to criticize the government, and refugees are not normally allowed to do those kinds of things. So there is this, I think there's kind of a vacuum there about protection of journalists in exile. And I want to commend actually Norway. Norway is one of the few countries that provide special humanitarian visas. But this is a growing population, journalists in exile. It's happening more and more because of conflict, but also because of authoritarian regimes that are coming into power. Journalists are going abroad, and they're doing a very valuable democratic work from abroad, building democracy, supporting democracy in their own countries. So I think this area really needs more attention. And I would say in the UN system, more cooperation between UNESCO, OHCHR, and UNHCR.
Thank you for that, Irene. And just as you were speaking, Andreas indicated that he wanted to speak. So you're in sync, the two of you. Andrea, please.
Thank you. Just to add that absolutely there is no doubt, as said, that when authoritarian regime take the power, the first want to control the media, and the other one is normally controlling the independent judiciary. What has changed is the type of capture, because of course with the evolution of the media environment, the capture that traditionally was done through laws, through commercial and monopoly in the current media environment has changed. So in this sense, I think now there is the importance of the difference between what is public interest information and what is not. So there was a three-tier media system we've been promoting in the 90s and onward about community media, commercial media, and public service broadcasting. Now, this difference is really this public interest information and journalism, as opposed to what is not. And this is one of the fundamental public good that also the Secretary General has been speaking about. And there is the Window Plus 30 Declaration Information as Public Good that has been endorsed by all UNESCO member states that is exactly going in this direction. And then let me just mention that I think in reaction to also what said that in the Global Digital Compact just approved, it's also mentioned that access to relevant, reliable, accurate information knowledge is essential for the inclusive, open, safe, and secure digital space. So again, back to the importance, of course, of the access to relevant, reliable, accurate information, which is in most cases coming, of course, from where? From public interest journalism.
Yeah. No, thank you. I want to quickly turn to Rafa and Hussein. Would you like to comment on this current series of points that were just raised? And if not, we will go to the audience, and I'm sure there'll be questions to you both. Is Rafa or Hussein, any?
I'm good. I mean, yeah, I can go to the questions. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Rafa.
Yeah, you can go.
Okay. So let's go to the audience. Please, all the hands go up. All right. If we can start in the beginning and then Larry will come to you. So start in the middle, please. Do we have a microphone? Oh, we would require you to go to the front because of all the microwave energy trained on us. The handhelds don't work. So we have to use.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Colette Walquist. I work for International Media Support based in Copenhagen, Denmark. I've been working very closely with the UN Plan of Action with many other civil society organizations in the room, CPJ and Free Press Unlimited, and maybe some more in the back. I would like all of us up here to reflect on what we're calling a fourth P in our 3P system, preventing attacks against journalists, protecting them in the face of attacks and prosecution. The fourth P is partnerships. We as civil society stand quite ready to partner and have, but particularly from in a proactive sense. We want to stop the attacks on journalists before they happen. And maybe I wanted to point just quickly to the support for national protection mechanisms that Andrea mentioned, and specifically on Irene Khan as well, on the fact that attacks against journalists are happening more often than not at the local or the national level, and what we can do there. This national protection mechanisms is somewhat of an abstract term, so I was hoping some reflection on that from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps we can take a few questions together and then come back to the panel to answer them. Larry, please.
Lawrence Moss, New York City Bar Association. So in one of my many former roles, I directed the Helmut Hammett grants at Human Rights Watch's only grant-making program. When that started out, it was, and the point I want to make is about how the repression extends not just to journalists for recognized outlets, but to all sorts of ordinary writers and bloggers. So when my program started out, originally, the beneficiaries were major novelists in Eastern European countries, prominent writers. And over the years, it became more and more bloggers, people writing simply in social media who were getting long prison sentences around the world. And we were giving these individuals grants to support their families while they were in prison. And this was often in countries where there was no established independent media. A lot of journalists came from, or these bloggers came from China, Vietnam, other countries like that. And so this repression of free expression extends all the way down to all sorts of people who are basically independent writers or independent journalists. So that's the point I wanted to make.
And just, am I understanding you correctly, Larry, that you're saying that the scope should be wider than the traditional definition of what a journalist is like? I mean, in your committee, do you take an expanded approach to this, Jody, or is it defined as a sort of profession that doesn't capture the wider sort of environment?
So we focus on those who produce the news, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a card-carrying journalist. And as we already heard from Hussein, that many of the journalists that remain in Gaza, for example, don't necessarily work for a formal news outlet, but they are doing the work of journalism in documenting and providing news. So it would extend to that.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of, Al Jazeera, Wall Street Journal, they have at least prominent organizations to try and defend their journalists when they get in trouble. Many of these individuals have nobody standing behind them.
Any other questions from the audience? No. Albert, please.
Hello, Albert Trithart from IPI. We've been hearing a lot about the challenges to getting the truth out from conflict zones when journalists are facing these kinds of threats. I'm interested to hear a little bit more, especially from you, Rafa and Hazem, about some of the challenges for people who are in places like Gaza and Sudan when they don't have access to the journalism they need to provide potentially life-saving information.
It's an excellent point. There's a corollary to that. Perhaps I could just add this. On one occasion, during the war in Syria, there was a particular town that was in very great danger of being overrun. And there was one source in the town that was connecting to the outside world. And he was mainly connecting to my office, to the Human Rights Office. And I think there was a calculation made there that if they connected to the media, they might be identifying themselves and then subject to attack. But connecting to us, we could go public, and we did go public, and not just us, other parts of the UN, while the person, the source, who kept streaming the information to us live. So, Hazem, when you're in a conflict zone, is there an awareness, I mean, going to Jodi's point, of the menu of options that you can pursue to get the information out? That there may be a public angle that's necessary, but through the public, you're trying to influence policymakers as well. But there may be just other channels that don't expose you as much, but for which you might get some similar effect that a policy can change. Is there an awareness of that?
Well, I mean, covering a conflict is not easy wherever, it's happening, whether in Gaza or somewhere else. Of course, being outside is not easy of covering, but I'm a Palestinian, I know the community, I know the people. I'm already there for ages. I know I'm well connected. I know it geographically, social level, whatever. So I have access. I know that it's unlike others, like foreigners who would be willing to cover the conflict. That's why the foreign media is looking. The foreign media is depending mainly on local journalists, and that's essential to be trained and well equipped and being aware of everything. So because they rely on them, I know the people, so I approach them, I talk to them. I am member of different channels and ways. I mean, I have to admit that social media currently made our job much easier than it used to be in the early days. We have WhatsApp groups, we have Telegram channels, we have Facebook, X, whatever. So there are a lot of YouTube videos. Technology is making us able to geolocate even some videos to verify it. Not whatever, being said, could be trusted or believed. So we go different level of or different layers of verification, which is not happening sometimes, to be honest, for some media, not because they have a problem, because they don't have the equipment, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the money. when it comes to the local media, for example, I mean, like, even if I was in Gaza, for example, the movement, even inside Gaza for the local journalists or even foreign journalists, in case they were allowed, would be restricted. You know, we are talking about two separated areas, north and the south. So those journalists who are in the north, they are not able to go for a story in the south, and vice versa. And even like I was in Gaza at some point, I was trapped in the central area in Nusayrat camp, and I couldn't move because, you know, I was doing kind of some similar to what I'm doing currently, because I can't go back to Gaza City, and I can't go farther because it's dangerous bombardment alone. I mean, 24/7.
No, I think what you're saying is critical for our understanding. I suppose my question was that if you're a journalist in a war zone, and your principal job is to try and report, you have all these contacts, you're trying to report the story to the outside world as best you can. But do you also have the phone number of the person in the registrar, or let's say registry of the ICC, who's handling witness protection? Do you have the phone number of the person in the office of the prosecutor to whom you can direct the evidence that you're collecting? In other words, that you are a source on the ground. Your job is to get the story, the facts out so the world hears them. But are you also aware of all the other places the evidence can go to? Because the office may say to you, Hassan, you are now in a critical spot. We have no source other than you. We need you to do this, that, the other, but don't go public, don't go airing your broadcasts, because it's more important to us that you collect this information than potentially betraying your position and having to move. I mean, is there that sort of interaction or not?
Well, I mean, our job is being journalists. We are reporting to the media outlets. It's not our job to contact ICC or whoever. Like, I mean, of course, we are a source after the job is done.
Yeah.
I mean,
Good.
if we look at the ICC report, I mean, it was. I mean, they refer to many investigations that were done by media outlets. So, of course, we are in touch with the local communities. We are, I mean, like, I'm a member of different syndicates. Like, yeah. So, if something happened to me, I would report them to, and they would be in touch with other organizations. You know, like directly, we are not in touch with the organizations. We could, I mean, in previous situations, we were being reached by different bodies, international bodies, to verify about specific incidents or information. Of course, that was privately, and I mean, and they asked us if they can reveal our identity or not. But I mean, by directly, we are not doing. We are doing the journalism, the telling what's happening on the ground.
Yes, no, I think that's an excellent point to keep stressing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Esmond.
I think Jody had a very important point earlier, which I think governments need to take very seriously, is that when, however tempting it is, when you start making these fake news laws, you are beginning sort of the slippery slope towards the Ministry of Truth. And I think there are a lot of people with extremely good intentions, you know, seriously good intention, pro-democratic governments who think that this is the way to go. But it is at least problematic because, you know, by saying that this is free media, but this is propaganda, this is fake, you are already, you know, you're already establishing this as being something that a government is supposed to do. And I think in a liberal society, it's actually the individual who have to judge. But it's hard to say that because, of course, manipulation has gotten even easier now with the new media channels. I think when the pre-internet, a journalist was typically a member of some kind of organizations. It could be a very small paper, or it could be the New York Times or BBC. But there had to be some organization around it to get it out. You know, somebody had to print the paper. You were normally more than one. Today, you know, everybody with a cell phone can be a journalist, and by the way, also a good journalist, but also obviously a bad journalist. And to take example from my corner of the world, I mean, Norway associated us with most EU sanctions, but we've been hesitant on one, which is to prohibit distribution of RT, Russia television. Not because we don't see that it's a state-owned propaganda channel, which it obviously is, and that's its purpose, but because we have been, at least we're asking ourselves the question, are we then beginning, is that the beginning of the road towards Ministry of Truth? Remember that the main Soviet news outlet was called Pravda, which means truth in Russia, but it wasn't necessarily commensurate to the content. So I think these are things we need to reflect seriously about in liberal societies. How do we ensure that, you know, when we protect journalism, we actually also have to protect bad journalism? Otherwise, we are, in my view, this is complicated, to be frank, but in my view, we are on a rather slippery slope.
Yeah. Or at least also you protect the judiciary from political intervention and perversion, so that libel laws exist, defamation laws exist, and you take your case to court, but you feel that you will be given a fair hearing in court as well. Please, sir, in the middle there.
Thank you. I'm Trygve, also from International Media Support. First of all, I really want to thank you all for an excellent panel. This is one of the best media freedom discussions that I've seen for quite a while, and I have to say I've seen a lot. But this is definitely one of the better. I basically just want to amplify a point that has been made by Hussein, not least, but also by Jody, because I think it may be very banal, but I think it's also very, very important. And it is the fact that we remember that journalists, as much as we refer to them as courageous, as brave, they're not superhumans, they are humans. And I think that is a very banal point, but it's also very important. So when you are working, say, in a conflict, it's not just, you don't just go to work and experience a trauma there. You're in it 24/7. And that affects your ability to work. That affect, I mean, the fact that you see your kids being targeted, you see you're in constant stress, that you can, of course, argue from a human point of view that that's important to keep in mind. But it's also important to keep in mind in order to enable the journalists and the media to continue working. And I think that sort of attention is really, really important. And I mean, of course, I'd like to reflect on it if necessary, but thank you.
I think you make an excellent point. In any conflict, and I spent my first 2 years in the UN in a conflict zone, it's ordinary people doing heroic things, but it means that they're still experiencing, as you said, the pain and the trauma. And in the end, everyone is injured by the conflict. There's no one who leaves uninjured. So that goes for the population with all the stress, the mental stress that you go through, the loss of property, loss of family, loss of friends, survivor's guilt. Journalists have it too as well. And the PTSD is deep and rife. There are other issues as well, which are very normal. And we all know this, for those of us who've been in conflicts. You know, often alcoholism is high, families are separated. The stress of covering these stories leaves their mark well beyond the battlefields. And the overall sacrifice, I think, is what makes the profession so noble. I mean, it's not without sacrifice. So with that, we've reached the end of our time. Once again, we'd like to thank Espen and the Norwegian government for sponsoring this symposium. We thank all our distinguished panelists, in particular, Hazem and Rafa, and salute you for the work you do, and to encourage you to continue to do it. And to those of us here in New York, we thank the audience for being with us, and we bid you a good day. Thank you so much, all of you.